Good morning, everybody. I'm Camelia Rodriguez-Sackburn, and I'm the Program and Initiatives Manager at Grantmakers Concerned with Immigrants and Refugees. Welcome and thank you so much for joining us today for our webinar, United for All Dreamers, Strategies for Supporting AAPI, Black, and LGBTQ DACA Immigrants. This webinar came together as Hung Nguyen Yap at Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders in Philanthropy, or AAPI, and our GSER team were talking about the concerning immigration environment for documented individuals and their families, particularly for communities that are often less visible. We're happy to be bringing you today's program. A few logistics to start with. This program is being recorded. If you have a question, we kindly ask that you use the chat box function on your computer throughout the webinar, and we will try to unmute for the Q&A as well. Right now, you are all muted. In addition to our GSER members, we would like to extend a special thanks to all of our co-sponsors on this webinar: Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders in Philanthropy, AAPI, AAPI, a philanthropic partnership for Black communities, Change Philanthropy, Funders for LGBTQ Issues, Hispanics in Philanthropy, Northern California Grantmakers, Southern California Grantmakers, and United Philanthropy Forum. Thank you all. Unfortunately, our original moderator, Rini Chakraborty of the For Freedoms Fund, is sick and won't be able to join us today, and we send Rini healing wishes. Luckily, my colleague Arya Summers-Landsberger, GSER's Director of Programs, will be moderating today's program, and it's my pleasure to pass the baton to Arya.
Thank you very much, Camelia, for the introduction. I really appreciate it. I'm honored to be on this call today and also send out my healing wishes to Rini as well. So to start out today, I think what we'd like to do is really provide a quick overview of the webinar goals, as well as providing just a bit of context before we move to our speakers who we're thrilled to have today. The webinar goals for today are to hear an update on DACA, the program's impact and implications with it ending within the larger immigration policy context, with a focus on the AAPI, Black diaspora, and LGBTQ community. Secondly, to understand the immediate and long-term needs, challenges, and opportunities related to diverse documented individuals and their families, and to learn about key funding strategies at the local, state, and national level to reach and support AAPI, Black diaspora, and LGBTQ documented individuals. In terms of context, many of you may have attended our additional webinars related to DACA. By way of quick background, DACA was established by President Obama through an executive order in 2012 after the DREAM Act unfortunately failed to pass in the Senate. As a result of DACA, nearly 800,000 young people have benefited from the DACA status that provides deferment from deportation and access to work permits, opening up expanded possibilities of employment and education. However, during the current Trump administration, we have seen a number of terminations and rescissions of programs, not just DACA, but also TPS, which was covered in our prior monthly policy call. There are significant concerns and implications for less visible immigrant communities, such as the AAPI, African diaspora, and LGBTQ communities. For this reason, we felt it urgent to do a webinar to really uplift the key issues pertaining to these communities. Next slide, please. And so today we are very honored to have two very distinguished community members to address the needs and advancing opportunities for DACA's promise and strategies post-DACA in the new immigration landscape. We'll be hearing from R.T. Coley of Advancing Justice, the Asian Law Caucus, Jonathan Jays Green of the Undocu Black Network. We'll also be learning about funder perspective strategies and practices from Marco Antonio Quiroga of the Contigo Fund of the Our Fund Foundation, Julia Yang Wingenbach from the Unbound Philanthropy, and Ali Larson from the Greater Twin Cities United Way. We will have plenty of time for Q&A, so please feel free to post your questions on the chat and hopefully we can also unmute folks at the end. And we will have some closing remarks from Huang and Camelia at the end. Thank you so much. And with that, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Arti Kohli. She's the Executive Director of Advancing Justice Asian Law Caucus. Previously the Deputy Director, Arti is an experienced nonprofit lawyer, manager, and philanthropic advisor with more than 15 years of experience in issues impacting low-income and undocumented immigrants. Prior to her role as Deputy Director, Arti led her own consulting practice, where she managed politics of demographic change and immigration reform at the UC Berkeley Graduate School of Journalism. Arti was also the Director of Immigration Policy at the Warren Institute at UC Berkeley School of Law and worked on a range of issues from bankruptcy to voting rights as Judiciary Committee Counsel to Representative Howard Berman of California. Before working for Congress, she served as Assistant Legislative Director at Unite Union in Washington, D.C., where she lobbied on behalf of low-income garment workers. Thank you so much, Arti, for joining us today. I'll hand it off to you.
Thank you, Aria. My pleasure. So I have the pleasure of talking about AAPI, undocumented youth, and I really want to thank all the sponsors for inviting me to talk about this community that I've been working with for a long time and is often invisible. So I am the Executive Director of Advancing Justice Asian Law Caucus, and we are a civil rights organization that works on a range of issues around immigrants' rights. And in 2008, we started getting API undocumented youth coming to us for legal support. And we also realized that they felt very isolated and not very connected to other undocumented youth networks. So we helped start a program which is still a part of Asian Law Caucus, and it's called Aspire. And it is a program that was set up to help build, initially to provide a safe space, and then it grew to so much more, to help build leadership development and also to really help grow the voices of directly impacted people and make sure that the work that we were doing at the caucus reflected what were the actual needs of the community. So we have benefited a lot from having Aspire as part of our organization. And so I'm going to fast forward a little bit because I was asked to talk about the impact of DACA. And this picture of, and I know almost everybody, I know everybody in this picture, is really reflective of the diversity of API undocumented youth. They are, New is in the center. He was the first undocumented medical student. We have Dean to the left of him who actually had a situation with where he was arrested for a minor offense and then ended up in a detention center, and we were able to help get him out, and he's now working as an advocate at a local nonprofit. And then you have Akiko, who's a nurse. So really the impact for a lot of these folks in this picture has really been the ability to work, to go to school, have access to health care, have driver's licenses, have the ability to help support their families. It's been really life-changing for a lot of our clients and Aspire members. So when DACA, the end of DACA was announced, obviously a lot of people were shaken up. There was questions about strategy, and what was great was that the API undocumented youth community, although while there aren't a lot of large organizations, they tend to be small groups, came together. And there's actually a website, aapidream.org, And you can look at some of the organizing that is happening now post the DACA announcement. So these are pictures from about 120 API undocumented youth and leaders and organizational leaders did an action in DC around a Clean Dream Act and also met with members of Congress. So there's pictures of, from DC. And we are planning to go back on December 8th, which is the deadline for passing a Clean Dream Act. So the organizing piece has really been great. It's come together prior to this AAPI coalition, which includes about 18 orgs, including NACASEC and SALT and Korean Resource Center and our Advancing Justice affiliates. I won't go into all the organizations. You can look at the website. Prior to this, we had an API, and we still have an API DACA collaborative. And a lot of that, the goal of that collaborative was to do outreach, because the take-up rates for DACA for API communities have traditionally been low. These are communities that are fairly isolated, very suspicious of government. So for many years, we've been working out in the communities to encourage people to take advantage of DACA. And when people did take advantage of DACA, it was because they really wanted work authorization and all the other things that came with DACA. Often, once you have a job, then you have access to health care, depending on, and then you have the ability to get a driver's license if you have DACA, all these things that were really important. So the other thing we did right away after the announcement came is we had already been working, because people were aware that DACA might end, on questions that people who had DACA had about, what do I have to tell my employer, when is it going to expire, all kinds of basic things. So we had been working on this, so had the National Immigration Law Center, and we came together with them and United We Dream to put together this FAQ about DACA and employment, which all of our organizations have distributed far and wide and have gotten a lot of feedback on. Positive feedback in terms of people really appreciating this information. So in terms of numbers of when DACA will expire, I found not a lot of data, but this came from Center for American Progress and Forward.us. And I think it was created before the actual announcement. So there's a couple of things that may not be entirely accurate, but it gives you a sense of when the work authorizations will be expiring, which is pretty disturbing that starting next year we'll be having significant elimination of work authorization. And this next chart tells you job losses. They're estimating that about 91% of people on DACA have jobs. And so they're estimating job losses per month, which are like on average about 30,000 jobs lost per month up until 2019. So really significant numbers of, thousands of DACA-mented folks, most likely having to find some other alternative to traditional employment. And this is an area that we've been very focused on, and we've been asked by universities, the UCs have reached out, the California legislature has reached out to us to think through alternatives to traditional employment, ways for people to get some compensation, and so we are really trying to think through that piece, because it's not just relevant for people with DACA, it's also relevant for people with TPS. Because once you lose work authorization and if you, as a result, lose your job, you also lose other things, for example, like health care. So some of the other things I was asked to address is what are the gaps that we're most concerned about for AAPI immigrants? And I think one of the main issues for us is really leadership development. This is a picture of one of our Aspire members testifying on behalf of SB 4, which was a bill that passed in California that increased Medi-Cal access for undocumented youth up to the age of 19. And that would not have happened but for the voices of directly impacted youth. And there just traditionally, there hasn't been the support for AAPI communities, although we have about approximately 1.5 million undocumented people from Asia in the United States. There just hasn't been that level of investment in our communities that we feel is needed. So that's something in our organization we've prioritized. That's why we have Aspire as part of our programs. And then in terms of other things, we do feel like while DACA is really important, it's not everything. We have members of Aspire who've never had DACA. And we have to look at all the ways to help build local power and ranging from sanctuary to health, education. All of these areas of work are important to invest in and for undocumented youth and families. And really appreciate your support of our communities, and I'm so proud to have these folks really as our leaders. They've been leading the way for years now, and I feel like the best we can do right now is follow their lead and help invest in all the areas that documented youth and their families need support in. So I think that's my time. I will move on to pass it on to Jonathan, and I'm sure I'll be happy to take questions later in the Q&A. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Arti. This is Aria from GSAR. We really appreciate it. Before we move on to Jonathan, we did just want to ask one question that came in, which is just around who is the AAPI community? For those that are on the call that aren't as familiar with the AAPI community, could you break it down a little bit more, some of the diversity and different challenges and opportunities within the AAPI community? That would be
great. Yeah. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you clearly.
Okay, sure. Sorry. So, of course, and that's a very good question. It's a really diverse community. So we have all the way from East Asia. We have, and if you're talking about undocumented youth, Koreans, South Koreans, Chinese, Indian immigrants, and Filipinos are sort of the largest numbers of undocumented folks in the country, but it is really, really broad, including folks from Southeast Asia. And actually sometimes the numbers are skewed. We actually have quite a few Chinese youth who are members of Aspire who actually came from Peru and Ecuador. And so their trajectory is somewhat interesting, and sometimes they might be in the data characterized as South American, but actually they're Asian Americans or and Pacific Islanders. So it's a really wide, diverse community. We define Asian very broadly all the way to West Asia, and actually when the Migration Policy Institute, you can look on their website in terms of how they define Asia, and it goes pretty far west. So we include in our work MEMSA communities, so Arab, Middle Eastern, Muslim, South Asian communities in our definition of Asian.
Thank you so much, Arti. That's really helpful. And I think there are some other questions, but I'd like to move on to Jonathan, and we'll address those at the end of Jonathan's presentation. So we're very honored to have Jonathan J. Green joining us today. He's the National Coordinator of the Undocumented Black Network, a network of directly affected Black undocumented people fighting to transform their own realities. He's an organizer, speaker, strategist, politico, and believer. He is also a queer, undocumented Afro-Panamanian and one of the co-founders of the Undocumented Black Network. Jonathan comes into this work after serving as a liaison and advocate of the Latinx and Caribbean communities in the Office of the Governor of Maryland. He also fought to pass progressive statewide legislation like the DREAM Act and marriage equality, and supported a woman of color-owned small business in its growth and development. Jonathan received his associate's degree from Montgomery College and his bachelor's degree from Dowcher College. We're so honored to have you, Jonathan, on our call today. There are already questions coming in for you around TPS, and I know that's going to be in your presentation. So we really look forward to hearing updates about TPS, its impact on the Haitian people as well as the broader Black diaspora. So thank you so much, Jonathan. I'll pass the baton to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for organizing this webinar and for having me as a part of this presentation. As Amelia said, my name is Jonathan J. Green, and I'm the co-founder of the Undocumented Black Network. If we could go on to the next slide. Yep. So we're a multi-generational network of undocumented Black people organizing our own communities and building power. We're relatively new. We started in 2016. As part of a response and really recognizing what was happening in Baltimore, right? So I live in Baltimore, and really taking in and being outraged by what was happening with the death of Freddie Gray, right? And seeing the lack of intersectional organizing that was led by those directly impacted, right? So we created what we call the Undocumented Black Convening, which happened in Miami. And that was mainly a space for our people to heal, right? We realized that a lot of us had never had an opportunity to really come into our space and really make it our own and be able to see our people and strategize the way forward for our own communities. So that's what led to the creation of the Undocumented and Black Convening. And after that, we decided that we wanted to make sure that this wasn't just a one-off event, right? We wanted to create an institution that was first and foremost led by those directly impacted, right? Because we know that as undocumented people that we have the power, we have the solutions, we have the brilliance, right, to be able to lead us through these difficult times, right? But also it was really important to make sure that it was centered on our undocumented Black community because there had been so little work done to be able to support our community, to be able to see and understand what our community goes through, right? So since then, we've established 3 chapters in DMV, which if you're not from the area, you might be like, what? The Motor Vehicle Association? No. But it's D.C., Maryland, and Virginia, and then Los Angeles, California, and New York City. We also have members in 15 states and growing, and really taking on this task of building an institution that's focused on our community, that continues to see, right, and love and provide support to our people. Next slide, please.
Jonathan, could we also ask you to speak a little bit closer to the phone? There are a few folks who are having a hard time hearing you.
Got it. Thank you. So
perfect. Thank you. Okay.
Yeah. No problem. So how do we do our work? So there are 3 main areas that we focus on. One, which is developing the leadership of our members through tools, trainings, and programming. 2, building power with and for our communities through advocacy, local organizing, and building strategic alliances to advance policies that affect our daily lives. I'll be sharing a little bit about TPS and DACA and how it affects our community in particular. And the last one, which to me is the most important one, it is centering the humanity, dignity, and the well-being of our communities in all aspects of our work. So I'll share a little bit about those three areas. So a little bit of quick facts about our community. So there's approximately 600,000 Black undocumented folks in this country. And I think one of the main challenges with our community is that because folks keep forgetting that there is a Black undocumented community or, just don't see us, there's often not enough data to be able to really back up and show how our community experiences this country, right? So our partners at the Black Alliance for Just Immigration put out a report called The State of Black Immigrants with the New York University School of Law last year that really provided a lot of framework to the work that we're doing and also how we understand Black immigrants and Black undocumented folks in particular, right? So the top 3 countries where Black immigrants and also Black undocumented folks in particular come from are Jamaica, Haiti, and Nigeria. And then the top 5 states where our folks live are California, New York, Texas, Florida, and Maryland. Next slide. Perfect, thank you. So this is just a chart that shows the data where we got this information from, which is from 2014. But this is what we have so far. You can see the amount of numbers and the other countries that follow those top 3 countries. And then on the right, you see a pie chart that demonstrates the area where our folks are coming from, close to half from the Caribbean, and then 39% from the African continent, and then sprinkled in through Latin America and a little bit of Europe and Asia as well. A little bit more about information about our community. So our Black immigrants make up about 10% of the U.S. Black population, about 8% of the immigrant population, and then 16% of the Black immigrant population is undocumented. So that helps you frame where Black immigrants and Black undocumented folks in particular are in terms of numbers. And the top 3 ways in which our folks gain status are through refugee asylum petitions, family sponsors, and then the diversity visa program. This will become a little bit relevant when we talk about policy because all of these things are coincidentally under attack, right? According to a study that BIN, the Black Immigration Network, put out, close to half of the diversity visa recipients in 2014 were African, right? So with the latest attacks on the diversity visa program, that's something that definitely impacts our community. If you can go to the next slide. Yep, thank you. So I think what's really important is that whenever we talk about Undocu-Black and the importance of centering Black people in the conversation around immigration, I want people to understand and want a Black person to talk about it, but it's also even more important that we talk about how Black people experience immigration in this country, right? And again, like I shared before, because of the lack of data, it's been really hard for people to even try to acknowledge what's going on with our folks. The 2 data points that I often use to be able to paint a clearer picture is that in 2014, the Migration Policy Institute had a study looking into African immigrants, and it showed that our folks are among the highest educated immigrants that are in the country, but yet they're the most underemployed, right? So what does it mean to have all this education and not being able to access jobs that match, right, their level of education? And then 2, the report, the State of Black Immigrants report that I shared earlier, really paints a clear picture about how our folks are criminalized in the system, right? So our folks are 3 times more likely to be detained and deported for a criminal conviction. And then 2, we, Black immigrants, make up Black undocumented folks make 5% of the undocumented population, yet they make up 20 to 23% of deportations. So with all of that as a background, we've been talking about how do we push for policy solutions that address what our community is experiencing, right, from the lens of having our folks' personal experience impact and lead that work. So number one, we've been working on passing a Clean Dream Act, which I'll go into what that means a little bit later, and then TPS, which is temporary protective status, which we want a permanent solution to those folks who are in that status. And you can find a lot more information about this on our website on docublack.org. We have a tab that talks about the policy issues, and then also on our social media. Next slide. So for DACA, I have DACA. My work permit expires January 2019, so I have a little bit of ways to go, but the numbers have shown that there are close between 12 to 16,000 Black documented immigrants in this country, and numbers are always hard to obtain because I think the methodology into how people are measuring how many of our folks there are, it's always interesting, right? Like, for example, for me, being from Panama, being an Afro-Latino, I'm not always sure that my folks are always counted in these numbers, so I take that with a grain of salt, but these are the numbers that are reported so far. And I think the conversation around DACA and the DREAM Act is really important for us because, one, yes, we have our folks who have DACA, and this fly young lady on the right that you see, her name is Toyosi. Toyosi is one of our members who actually lives in Austin, Texas. She is a chemical engineering student with a concentration in textiles. And this picture was taken when she was showcasing her collection of designs at Fest Africa at her student organization at UT Austin. She wants to one day create wearable technology to improve everyday life, like clothing to repel mosquitoes and malarial zones. And her parents brought her to the U.S. from Nigeria when she was just 3. And I think, so for us, it's really important to be able to fight for people like Toyosi in this conversation, but also to fight for the rest of our community in this conversation around DACA. What do I mean by that? So we are actually a part of the Defend Our Dreams Steering Committee that's been pushing and leading the fight for a Clean Dream Act. And for us, it's been really important to make sure that as we pass something that is able to provide a relief for undocumented young people like myself in this country, that we're not harming the rest of the undocumented community in doing so. There's been many, many examples and quotes and tweets about how the right wants to use the support the American public has for undocumented young people to pass some of their draconian measures in terms of adding criminalization and border and interior enforcement to the bill, right? So that's what we mean by a Clean Dream Act. So nothing that adds or harms the rest of the undocumented community. And for us, we're particularly looking at criminalization and also the eradication of some of the legal programs that I just mentioned, like the diversity visa program and family sponsor / what they call chain migration, right? Because we know that that's one of the main ways in which our folks come into this country. So it's really important to be able to center all of our Black undocumented community in this conversation. Next page. So TPS. So TPS is temporary protective status, and that is the status that the U.S. government grants to nationals from a particular country that have gone through either environmental, political, or supernatural disasters, right? So currently, up until a month and a half ago, 10 countries had TPS, but actually in the beginning of the year, 13 countries had TPS. That included 3 West African nations, Guinea, Sierra Leone, and Liberia. They lost status in the spring. Sudan lost status not too long ago. And then Haiti got an extension until July 2019 when the program would end. So they're trying to phrase it as an extension, but we really know that it means that it's the end of the program, which means that we need a solution. TPS is one of those perfect examples that really show how immigration is a Black issue. 7 out of the 13 countries that had TPS in the beginning of this year were Black majority countries. You can see them listed: Guinea, Sierra Leone, Liberia, Haiti, Sudan, South Sudan. Thank you. And then close to 60,000 Haitians are about to lose their status. So they've been here for an average of 7 to 15 years in the United States, and they really need a permanent solution. There are 3 bills in Congress that would do that, but only one that we actually worked with some of the folks in the Senate to be able to write. It actually includes all 13 TPS countries, including the West African nations, and they would provide an actual path to permanent residency because we don't want to codify something that is temporary. We want to create a permanent solution. Next page. All right, and for the sake of time, I'll just go over this pretty quickly, but given all the context that I've given you about our community, it's safe to say that there's a lot of trauma that's happening with our folks. There's a lot of trauma to be undocumented today, and we've known that it's been trauma to be Black since the founding of this country, right? So what does it mean to be at that intersection without meaningful access to health care, right? So we've been having we launched a mental illness initiative about a month or two ago to expand the dialogue around mental illness in our own communities, to reduce the stigma around it, to create meaningful resources that can help our folks seek care. So what you see on the right is our mental illness, our guide for mental illness specialists that you can find on our website that can really help our specialists that are interested in caring for our people really understand the experience. So you can download that at undocublack.org/MWI. And then the bigger picture is how do we create a sustainable system that is able to provide care for our folks outside of what's happening now, right? So can we create a collective therapist that can provide support for our folks at either pro bono or low-cost services? That's what we're looking into so that you can see some of our work there. Next slide. And then an upcoming event that we're actually working with AAPI Immigrant Rights Organizing Table is that we, ahead of the big mobilizations that are happening December 6th, 7th, and 8th, we actually adopted December 5th as our own to be able to have a day where we're just focusing on the particular needs of our community that's often invisibilized in this conversation. We're building an actual workshops to talk about our particular experiences and how does white supremacy show up in our own communities, and how does that Blackness play a role in how we interact with each other, right? Because we want to be able to build towards authentic solidarity and then also take action and reach out to members of Congress and the general public to pass permanent solutions to our issues. So how can you support? You can definitely share our flyer and our event, which is on our social media. I'm happy to send that to folks. And also we're flying people in to be a part. We're looking at over 100 Black and API immigrants who participate in that day. So if you're interested in sponsoring attendees, you're more than welcome to. I'm happy to share more information with you separately. And then next slide. Great. Okay. So that is the end of my presentation. I hope that answers some of your questions, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what other questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. That was extremely helpful. It was great to have that contextual background. And I think one quick question, I think both of you mentioned this, and it's inside the campaign that you just talked about. You mentioned a Clean Dream Act, very clearly that it means that there will be no additional harm to other communities in order to pass a DREAM Act. And you also mentioned a deadline coming up, that there's a focus to try to push through this year. Can you, or each of you, just tell us a little bit about why there's a push to get it passed before the end of the year? And I noticed the campaign includes both DACA and TPS, so this is a joint campaign. So if you could talk about those questions, that would be very helpful.
I can definitely get started, and then if my colleague could take it, answer any questions that I missed. But the deadline, so we're looking at December 8th as the deadline. So we really need to get Congress to pass something before the end of the year, right, before they go home for the holidays, because every day that we don't pass any of these solutions, that means that more people are losing status. I was looking at a marker the Center for American Progress created. So based on the estimates, around 10,000 documented immigrants have lost their DACA that has expired because of their inability to renew, thanks to the arbitrary deadline that DHS created with September 5th and October. So there's definitely an urgency there to pass something ASAP because people are losing status. Like my colleague shared, any day that people are losing status, that means that they're unable to work, they're unable to live their lives freely in this country, and that's something that we absolutely cannot continue to support. particularly because of the mental, physical, and emotional toll that it takes on our people, right, to be able to live in this limbo and anxiety of what will happen to our communities, right? And yes, I think it's really important that people are beginning to add TPS to the fight, right? Because the way that I see it is that both of these programs are temporary, and then they also affect the community. But it really is about the community that has been here for a while, this community that is a part of the fabric of this country, right? And like we just absolutely cannot just throw folks out and just leave them up there hanging to be deported and detained as a part of this immigration justice, quote unquote, justice system.
Hi. Thanks, Jonathan. This is Arthi. I would just add, there's obviously, I think, a political piece to this in the sense that the idea is to have this be part of the budget process and be part of the continuing resolution that continues to fund the government. It's really unfortunate. I don't know if you guys saw the tweet that went out from the President this morning, which, where, as he puts, Chuck and Nancy are going to come talk to him about negotiating on that continuing resolution. And it didn't sound like he wanted to make a deal on these issues, which is, different from what we had heard before. But in any case, so the idea was that it would be easier for certain people who have tough districts where the anti-immigrant, for lack of a better word, districts who are very pro-immigration enforcement. We would need, some folks to agree to these bills, and it would be easier to do as part of the budget process. The closer we get to the 2018 elections, the more unlikely it is that those folks will be willing to take those votes. And so that's just another piece in addition to the absolute need to get this done as soon as possible.
Great. Thank you to both of you for that. Very helpful. And we have another question here from Maya Iwata around, it's actually around the census. So moving outside a little bit of the DACA and TPS advocacy, and whether you all, based on your work in your communities, have advice or guidelines on the delicate balance between the need to count undocumented and other vulnerable communities in the census, and also protecting their privacy and safety, especially with our current federal administration.
Yeah, that's a really important question. It's something that we've been thinking very deeply about. I wish I had the answer for you. I think part of what we're trying to see is if we're going to, and there has been advocacy with our partners in DC in terms of, what, if any, commitment are we going to get from this administration about census data, and then what options do we have legally? To sort of push for privacy. And we're exploring that piece in particular because we're not necessarily going to be relying on what this administration is going to say. So that said, we've worked really hard since the beginning of this year, and I know a lot of our allies have as well, to have that balance with everything that we're communicating to our communities in terms of taking the level of fear down, which is so palpable. At the same time, not over-promising things that we actually at this moment can't promise, right? So it's a balance that we've had to kind of set throughout the year of really trying to educate people on their rights, and what the federal government can do and what they can't do, and how are we locally going to be trying to protect, what are the measures we're going to take locally to protect people. And that's something that's a conversation that's happening with local legislators and civic leaders as well in terms of trying to ensure that we do get an accurate census.
Thank you, Arthi. Jonathan, did you want to add anything?
I think that's a really good question. We're also not there, and I think mainly because we're trying to. I think we generally just operate from state of emergency, right? And like what's most urgent right now is like trying to figure out how to get our folks to not be deported. But I think it's a conversation that we should be thinking about. And I know that some other groups like the Black Immigration Network, they're thinking about that as well. So I think I don't think we'll play a leading role on that, but I think we'll try to figure out how we fit in then, if that makes sense.
Yes, indeed, Jonathan, it does make sense. I think funders and many of us are struggling in that balance between the short-term responses and the need in the crisis moment and the long game and the long-term strategy as well. So I think that that really reflects a common struggle across philanthropy and you all as well. So thank you so much. I know there are still more questions, but we would like to move on to our next section, which is really delving into how funders are responding to DACA and their reflections. And we're very honored to have 3 funders with us today to unpack how they're approaching it, and then we'll have some additional time for Q&A. So I'd like to introduce Marco Antonio Quiroga. He's the Program Director of the Contigo Fund. So Marco, we're very honored to have you with us today, so I'll hand it off to you. Thanks so much. And just a reminder, everyone, sorry, that we are on, this is an hour-and-a-half webinar, so please stay on the line to listen to the funder engagement piece and to continue the conversation with Arthi and Jonathan. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, everyone. This is Marco, and I wanted to start off the conversation a little bit by sharing about my journey, my funder journey and connections to DACA work, because it's important to the 2 reflections that I'd like to leave with you all today at this critical moment in our movement. My family immigrated from Peru when I was 2 years old, and we landed in Orlando, Florida. And I come from a mixed status family, U.S. citizen older brother, an undocumented mother, my sister who has DACA, queer younger brother who was deported and separated from my family back in 2005. And I myself have DACA. I am queer. And as an undocumented queer person of color, I can't say that I ever had a certain future in this country that I've called home since the age of 2. For this reason, I certainly never envisioned myself in philanthropy. It didn't seem like it was something I could ever have access to. It certainly wasn't an industry that was originally built for a person like me to have a leadership role in. But it was my resilient undocumented mother who taught me that I needed to be the change I wish to see in the world. And when the Pulse massacre struck my hometown of Orlando, it was the encouragement of colleagues in the field, from funders from LGBTQ issues, who knew that I had deep ties and roots to the communities most impacted by the tragedy, to believe and follow my heart, and encouraged me in doing so and supported me in moving into action, which turned into the Contigo Fund. And I am honored to lead a philanthropic, community-driven movement that has built leaders for Pulse-affected and historically marginalized LGBTQ communities of color, and encourages them to dare to dream for more access, more opportunity, more self-determination, and more dignity. And it's been through this work that we've realized through the Contigo Fund that in our region, there's a clear intersection between LGBTQ issues and immigrant rights issues in our region. One of the top 3 since Pulse, one of the top 3 requested services of the Orlando United Assistance Center, which was set up as a resilience center for those impacted, is immigration-related support. Families of victims, survivors, and their partners, all of which are undocumented, many of which are undocumented, are reflective of how clear this intersection really does impact our community and our region. But Orlando and Central Florida are in many ways a microcosm of so many parts of the U.S. South and across our country. And so what we learned here is very much what you all know in your own communities as well. And it's through the Contigo Fund, how we've responded is directly reflective of the leadership that we're composed of. Myself being at the helm of the Contigo Fund, I think is extraordinarily important because of my lived experience and that wisdom that I bring through this work and lens, but also being community-driven. Our community-driven model, which includes grant committee members who also have DACA and are at the crosshairs of this moment. This community-driven model is a strategy to be responsive in this toxic environment, and particularly for historically marginalized populations. And it's my story and the story of this individual that is also on our grant committee who is losing his DACA as well, kind of reflective of the opportunities of doors of opportunity that DACA has offered, the challenges and impact of an uncertain future that the termination of DACA has on those losing it and their families, and the impact it has on the future of our movement of folks awakening and rising up to say we deserve more. And through the Contigo Fund, because of this process and approach that we take, 100% of our grants are at the intersection of LGBTQ and racial equity, because the Pulse massacre specifically targeted LGBTQ people of color. And it was because of this that we take that very important lens and intersectional approach. For any individual who potential grantee who applies for our grant cycle, submits a proposal, if they're a mainstream LGBTQ organization, they have to include a strong racial justice lens, and vice versa for any other organization. Our approach prepared us for when the termination of DACA happened, because we invested in community organizations who were already connected and had deep ties to the communities who most needed the support once that announcement was made. We support one of our grantees I would mention is the Hope Community Center, who has been doing, it is a really phenomenal center in the rural farmer community of AAPI, which is just north of Orlando, which has been doing Know Your Rights trainings and safety preparedness, alongside another one of our grantees, which is the Farm Workers Association of Florida, which have jointly been doing DACA clinics and specifically have been outreaching and educating LGBTQ communities about these issues and how to educate their base about how to prepare themselves as well as to protect themselves. Another grantee that I will point out is QLatinx, which is made up of LGBTQ Latinx young folks who came together after Pulse and decided that their narratives weren't being uplifted, even though that this had a distinct impact on their community. Of course, the Pulse shooting, which took 49 lives and injured more than 50 other individuals. Most individuals who died, over 90%, were both LGBTQ and Latinx. And so building the leadership of this community was extraordinarily important to us. And now we see this community group as a core member of the Trust Coalition, which is moving advocacy forward around sanctuary here in our local community and across the region, and one of the strongest LGBTQ racial justice organizations in our region today. And then we also have nimble ways of going about how to do grants, because we understood, because of the Pulse tragedy, that we have to be nimble to future cases of disaster, tragedy, and responses to acts of hate. And so we have a rapid response fund that we've established, and when DACA was announced, we made a grant to Immigration Equality, which is a national LGBTQ immigrant rights organization, which is doing critical work in regards to doing screenings for individuals to see whether or not they will be able to have any other forms of relief, direct legal representation to individuals who are connected to the Orlando United Assistance Center who currently are lacking representation, and building a pro bono network, because our rapid response application specifically says that it's in response to an emergency and disaster, but We want them to figure out a way to actually get to the root causes of the issue. And in this region, in Central Florida, what we understood and saw is that there was a lack of culturally competent attorneys who could take on cases pro bono to actually affirmingly and competently represent LGBTQ immigrants in our region. And so as part of their grants, they're going to be building up a pro bono network in our region to ensure that in the future, for any individual who is seeking legal support, that they can actually find LGBTQ competent and affirming support around the issues that affect them uniquely. And so this leads me to the two reflections that I would leave you all with. Our journey really at this critical moment in our movement has shown us that, one, queer and trans, black and brown, gender nonconforming individuals are very much at the crosshairs of targeting in any increases in enforcement due to policing bias and sexual assault to physical abuse in detention centers. Our communities are going to be at the crosshairs of all of these, any enforcement measures that in the future were to take place are very much more vulnerable, and so we have to take that into account. And so this is very much an LGBTQ issue. And the second thing is our community-driven approach. We encourage funders to take on an approach that values the insights and wisdoms and decision-making powers of communities that are closest both to the challenges we face and the solutions we need. And we believe this to be a long-term strategy to reaching ultimately our collective liberation, which is our goal that we believe we're all on this journey of.
Thank you so much, Marco. A very personal and inspiring funder journey, and really appreciate the community-driven strategies and really effectively working at the nexus of these different communities. Really, really powerful. Thank you so much. And, represents, as we're moving through the landscape of funders, this, local, regional effort that the Contigo Fund has undertaken. And what I'd like to do next is move to Julia Yang, who is a national funder with Unbound. She's the U.S. Program Associate at Unbound Philanthropy. So I'd like to hand it off to you to now provide us with your perspective from a national vantage point. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Aria. Again, this is Julia Yang Winkenbach with Unbound Philanthropy. Before I dive into my reflections on this moment, I just wanted to share a little bit about Unbound Philanthropy for those who are unfamiliar with our work. We are an independent private grant-making foundation with offices in New York and London, working towards the goal and vision of advancing a world where all people, including those who identify as immigrants and refugees, can enjoy a life free of barriers to achieving their full economic, civic, and cultural participation in society. We make grants in the U.S. and UK, and since 2014, our grant making has focused largely on three broad priorities: legal rights and protections, immigrant integration at the local level, and building public understanding, most recently through popular culture interventions. I was really moved by Marco's story, and I think I want to try to continue that trajectory of centering impacted communities. And I think that, as the other speakers, RT and Jonathan demonstrated, DACA really opened up a range of opportunities for young Americans, and we really see those results so clearly in the ongoing national debate about the moral imperative to pass a Clean Dream Act before the year end. And with DACA, our foundation saw an opportunity to embrace a core value and approach to our work, which has always been about centering and lifting up communities most impacted by policies and empowering them to be spokespeople and active in civic debates that impact their lives. I want to bring us back to the 2012 aftermath of the announcement of DACA and our thinking around grant making at that time. We recognized early on that any grant making to support implementation of DACA should also sustain the leadership of those directly impacted, particularly the undocumented young people whose voices and stories were essential to winning DACA in the first place. And I really want to underscore that because I didn't hear it explicitly mentioned in the previous comments, and I think it's important to remember. Through this process, we really saw how our grantees and other partners strategically leveraged DACA's implementation as a vehicle for leadership development, civic engagement, and membership outreach. But we also noticed and took stock of visible and prominent gaps, most notably the lower application rates among AAPI and Black DACA eligible immigrants. So we did what a national funder does, and we tried to explore several strategies and pilot projects that could potentially expand access to immigration legal services and leadership development opportunities for Black and Asian immigrants. RT briefly described the formation of the AAPI DACA Collaborative, which we supported at its inception to provide additional capacity to some members of the collaborative to increase application rates. We also worked with the Four Freedoms Fund, a collaborative fund for state and local immigrant rights funding to support the Black Immigrant Engagement Initiative in New York City, which was designed and implemented by the New York Immigration Coalition, African Communities Together, and the Black Alliance for Just Immigration. And it too was an effort to build capacity to provide application assistance to Black immigrants for DACA and other forms of relief and serve as a model for comparable initiatives elsewhere. And from those experiences, I think they really underscored, again, the importance of integrating a holistic approach to supporting legal services, advocacy, and leadership development approaches. And we saw that those efforts definitely did build up capacity, but they were also not sufficient given the need and the limited resources available. So those are some of my reflections from learnings on DACA's initial implementation and what it has left us with. In the immediate aftermath of DACA's termination, I want to reflect on a couple of things. We had been thinking about it a few weeks prior to the actual announcement and really trying to figure out ways that we could be proactive and responsive because we knew that something was coming. And our approach there was really to listen to the field. And so when the rumors first began circulating, the first kind of grant a rapid response grant that we gave was to support NACASAC and its Dream Action Vigil, which was a 22-day round-the-clock vigil in front of the White House in D.C., which helped to lift up the stories and lived experiences of AAPI documented individuals and their families at a really critical time when the field really needed something rejuvenating and uplifting, and also to build ties among impacted members, really. And the reactions from that action, I think, were quite robust, given the times that we found ourselves in. Another example I'll share is in the aftermath of the DACA decision, we organized a funder education and coordination effort to educate other funders about a rapid response joint campaign called Defend Our Dreams, led by the National Immigration Law Center and United We Dream Network. And this campaign, which is still underway, was an effort to coordinate and engage a broad set of stakeholders on several activities, including efforts to push for passage of a Clean Dream Act this year, and to address immediate needs of documented young people, including a pot set aside for addressing folks who were eligible for a narrow window to renew their DACA, called the DACA Renewals Fund in different iterations. And I think what is remarkable about the campaign is how the coalition itself reflects the broad community of impacted populations, including AAPI and Black immigrant leaders. And I think that's a direct result of intentional investments to lift up these communities and voices that we couldn't have seen without, we couldn't have seen 10 years ago, quite frankly, without the direct investments that we and other funders made. And the last example I'll share about our response is really this idea of innovation and the need to support, and several of the speakers alluded to this, but the need to support projects and ideas that are that infuse this idea of helping immigrants thrive through entrepreneurship, through alternative ways of gaining gainful employment, because I think that aspect of strategy is critical to ensuring that we don't lose sight of the fact that there is a window of opportunity to be creative about the approaches that are undertaken right now to support immigrants, undocumented immigrants, and their ideas and visions. And an example that I would share is our nascent support of Educators for Fair Consideration's Immigrants Rising initiative, which you can learn more about at immigrantsrising.org. And I think to close, I want to lift up a couple of themes that I hoped I touched on. The first being in moving forward and thinking about strategies to support the field, I think it's critical to continuing centering the leadership of impacted communities and following their lead. And this could mean several things. For us, one strategy has been to provide funds to support convenings, because we think that it's important to bring people together as a practical matter and as a relationship building strategy. And two, I think the one question that we're grappling with is how do we scale up solutions to address the extreme duress that I think a lot of communities will continue to find themselves in, especially if a legislative solution like Clean Dream doesn't come to pass this year. And what sort of thinking can we all engage in to figure out solutions that are responsive to the multitude of needs that I think will come up in the arena of health, education, legal services, and so forth. And with that, I will hand it back to Arya, and thank you all for your time.
Thank you so much, Julia, for taking us through that journey on DACA and also your journey through grant making at Unbound. I really appreciate centering us and reminding us that it was youth leadership and impacted young people who themselves led to the creation of DACA. So thank you for reminding us of that and highlighting that holistic approach. Really appreciate that. So with that, I'd like to move forward with Allie Larson, who's the Program Manager for Community Impact with the Greater Twin Cities of United Way, engaging in statewide grant making. So thank you, Allie, for joining us today. I look forward to hearing about your journey as well.
Sure. Thanks so much for having me, and certainly very tough acts to follow in that everybody is speaking their truths and really sharing a lot of insights that I hope to reflect in my own comments as well. Here in Minnesota, I am the proud coordinator for a funder collaborative called Solidarity Minnesota. So I'm hired by the United Way, and I work funding specific areas in that role, but also lead this funder collaborative. So if you advance to the next slide, you'll see that our coalition is made up of multiple funders here in Minnesota who've all put money into a combined pot, and I should say both money, expertise, time management, to gather together in response to the executive orders earlier this year. So we're a new coalition, and this is a new level of partnership for the funders here in Minnesota to try to support immigrants and refugees. The next slide, you'll see a little bit about us. One of the things that I think is really important to reflect on is as we learn to center voices of the communities most impacted, it's very easy to say that and very hard to accomplish it with meaning. And one of the things that we reflected on here as a coalition is the work that we did to try to center the voices that we already knew and had on staff. And so Minnesota is graced with a diversity fellowship program called the McKinley Fellows, and one of the lessons learned for Solidarity Minnesota as we came together is the McKinley Fellows were not initially invited to be leaders on the coalition, and that was something that we had to learn the hard way in terms of reflecting on how we can do better. Another thing that we were learning is that we have funder expertise. We have funders here who are part of the coalition who have grassroots relationships, and we wanted to make sure that as a coalition we respect those relationships and center them and their voices in the coalition leadership. And then the final thing is we have members in the coalition from across the state, but most of us are funding in the Twin Cities region, and we recognize that there are a diversity of needs for immigrants and refugees across the state, and that the needs that are facing those communities and the opportunities and assets on the ground are very different in rural and urban areas. And so here in Minnesota, we've leveraged a statewide network of funders who are participants on the coalition, both through the United Way, which has 40 locations across Minnesota, and also initiative foundations, which are funded from one of our partners, the McKnight Foundation. The next thing is back to the former slide, sorry about that. We also think very much about our process as being as important as our product. And so we recognize that when we didn't have all of the expertise on the ground that we needed in order to make the best decisions about where to invest rapid and emergency resources, we brought on what we consider to be cultural consultants. So one of them is Julia Opoti, who identifies as coming from an African immigrant community and is also LGBTQI identifying herself, and also New Publica communications consultant that identifies as reflecting the Latino community. We built our process around community engagement, and so one of the things we know we needed to do was connect with grassroots organizers and grassroots advocacy, and we knew that we needed to use non-traditional networks to get that done. So our cultural consultants were critical in helping us accomplish that vision. We also translated many of our materials into Spanish and also produced Somali videos about our grant application in recognition of the fact that the Somali culture is an oral culture, and so written applications are not as effective for that community. We have a shared decision-making power model where every time we have an opportunity, including this one today, to speak with GSER, we are always trying to center our immigrant and refugee voices. And so when they are not able to step forward, I am a proud ally, but our decision-making process is always collaborative and works to center immigrant and refugee voice. Next slide. So in response to the executive orders, we've built a couple of grant-making rounds through this pooled resource that is Solidarity Minnesota. Our first opportunity was to fund microgrants, which were $2,500 investments. We invested a total of $200,000 in 80 grantees. We had massive turnout for that application. It was very short. We just had a couple questions. So we had 216 applications, and we used that as a resource to help guide our thinking in how to make more systemic and strategic investments in the future. Next slide. So you can see with the communities served, and I populated these so that there are some, you have to take a little bit with a grain of salt because we didn't want to make any of our applicants box themselves into a particular community. But we did have kind of an even number of grantees in the East African and Latino communities, but as you can see, a massive number of East African applicants, which makes sense for a number of reasons. Many of you may be aware that Minnesota is blessed with a very, very large Somali population. Next slide. So after the microgrants, we leveraged those learnings to invest in 2 other grant rounds. One was DACA investments, which we invested immediately after the DACA decision for rescission, and that was in 4 organizations that were invite only, but they were much larger grants. So 3 of the grants were at $40,000, one was at $80,000, and we issued a letter of support on behalf of our coalition that we have on our coalition website. The grantees are in multiple communities, but one specifically that's pertinent to this conversation is one of our grantees for the DACA investments is serving the African community and has outreach and leverage and relationships in that space. Next slide. Finally, we have a Strength and Resilience grant, which is a larger grant opportunity. Most of the grants will be $25,000. A few will be $75,000. We're hoping to invest between $400,000 and $1 million in the next year. Well, by the next year, I mean the next month, because in 2018 we will be funding in January. We had 159 applicants for this, and we plan to fund between 15 and 30, depending on our resources available. And again, we use the microgrants and the DACA investments as an opportunity to guide our funding priorities, including civic engagement, leadership development, know your rights, media justice, and immigrant and refugee-led organizations in Greater Minnesota. We have a 2-stage review process to center community voice. One would be a foundation review. About half of the members of the foundation review identify as coming from immigrant and refugee communities, and we will follow the foundation review with a community review, and the community review will be completely separate from the foundations. We have paid our community advocates a stipend to look at our grants. We have about 40 that will pass along to them. And the community reviewers, as a team of 7, will be responsible for telling us who they think the final funding slate should be. Next slide. So the next steps for Solidarity Minnesota are to assess the impact of our microgrants, invest those larger grants, and then share our learnings back with community to make sure that this wealth of resources we have about both the applicants who are working in Minnesota and also the grantees who are conducting the amazing work with resources is a resource that we share with both the community members and the foundations who are operating in Minnesota. Final slide. So in closing, I just wanted to thank the people who informed my comments here today, one of them being Julia Apoti, our cultural consultant, and another being Trina Olson, the Executive Director of P Fund Foundation, who invests in bold leaders and thriving LGBTQ communities here in Minnesota. I couldn't have put together these comments without them. And a few of the things they wanted to pass along was, what do you do when you're a foundation and you're looking to guide your thinking by centering impacted voices, but you don't necessarily have those relationships, or you might not have as many people on staff as you would hope to meet a particular need or meet a particular issue? In this case, perhaps it's AAPI, Black, or LGBTQ immigrants. So a couple of the recommendations that I would give in the next minute before I close would be, first, just to name the intersectionality or the hidden population that you're seeking to serve. Make sure if you're a funder, you're asking grantees thoughtful questions about those intersectionalities, and don't be afraid to have those conversations. In the LGBTQ space, we consider it a best practice to ask open-ended questions about gender and sexual orientation. And in the immigration space, of course, we advise everybody to make sure those conversations are not documented and are held in a safe space so that people can feel comfortable sharing their status. We want to pass along our lessons learned about doing your homework. So do some Googling about your community if you want to reach a new population. Check in with national policy groups. Check in with GSER. Find foundation partners focused on serving the population you hope to reach. A really good idea that came forward was to check in with newspapers and media serving your target community. Talk to the editor or reporter to see if they can identify leaders for you. Show up where people are congregating. So go to events, go to bars, go to cultural celebrations. Check out who the outreach workers are in those communities and ask them for ideas on leaders that you can connect with. Chat with faith organizations. Start by connecting with the people that you already know and then follow the conversation train. It can be really difficult to target grassroots organizers from a traditional mindset of a funder, and so start with the relationships you have. Start building trust now, and know that if you do the hard work, you're going to get to the workers on the ground that you most want to fund. And then the final comments would be recognize that solutions won't always look the way that you expect. Sometimes advocacy doesn't show up as the word advocacy or the word civic engagement on a funding application or in community, and so be creative and follow community voice and community wisdom to fund the work that you want to see change from. And then recognize that sometimes the underground work and invisibility is part of what makes groups successful. And so needing to protect the confidentiality of some groups who are operating under the surface might be part of what you're doing in order to do effective fundraising and fund making or grant making in this space. So work through trusted allies in order to accomplish those goals, and learn to constantly ask yourself, who is missing from this conversation? We know there's a difference between inviting immigrant and refugee voice and engaging it. So be humble and be curious, and thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to share our lessons learned.
Thank you so much, Ali. That was a fascinating and also really fantastic data. And a couple of questions have come in around the data that you shared, and it is, how did you compile that data? Did you hire a consultant, and how much work was this for grantees?
Yeah, so the grantees didn't do any of it, which is great. That was one of our things, is we wanted the application to be super short, and we wanted the grantee reporting to be very short. So the data compilation happens here in-house. Mostly it's me, and then I also have the gift of a close friend who's excellent in data compilation here at United Way, who helped me out with a bunch of it. And I'd be happy to share more of it. We have all of the different applications and grantees broken down by topic, by cultural community, by type of organization funded, budget size, a whole bunch of different ways that we've broken down the data to really understand the work happening across the state.
Great, great. And I'm sure we can connect you. There's a follow-up question around the video, how the video applications were structured, if they answered questions or did they actually come up with their own stories, and how did you get the information you needed?
Yeah, that's a great question. I should clarify, we just put together a video to talk about the opportunity. We didn't want to spend too much money on the resourcing of receiving videos in another language, because that would have meant that our administrative costs would have had to go up, so our grants out would go down. So that was a strategic decision and one that was difficult to make, but we just presented information in Somali so that the community would feel welcome to participate in the process, and we offered translation if necessary, but that didn't come up for us.
Great, thank you so much. Before I hand it off to Camelia and Huang, I did want to give our speakers, Jonathan and Arthi, an opportunity to provide a final takeaway or thought. Obviously, as experts, any particular strategy, guidance, things that you think funders should really be thinking about right now that you would like to lift up, particularly keeping in mind our centering theme, increasing visibility, naming the intersectionality. We'd appreciate your thoughts, and then I'll hand it off to Camelia and Juan.
Sure. So this is Arthi. I think that, first of all, I just really appreciated all the funder presentations, and particularly, the message of letting grantees and the community folks guide the work, which I think is a really powerful message. I will say that in the coming, from my perspective, I'm glad that we have this major campaign and narrative around the Clean Dream Act, and obviously we want to keep pushing that. But I really hope that, and I can see it sounds like people are looking at other things, and I do think that building local power is going to be really key, because if we don't get the Clean Dream Act, a lot of what's going to impact people is state and local policies, and whether they have access to in-state tuition, whether they have access to a driver's license. I believe it's about 12 states that provide driver's licenses for undocumented folks. But if you lose your work authorization and you're not in one of those states, for example, like Texas has like 120,000 people with DACA who most likely will lose their driver's license. That's why building state and local power is going to be so important. It's for addressing these key issues for DACA folks and their families, but it's actually what's going to lead to better legislative solutions for us in the long term. So that would be my key message.
Great, thank you. Jonathan?
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you for the opportunity to, again, just give final remarks. I think it's really important to make sure we're we've said this over and over again, but I think you'd be surprised how many times when we as undocumented talk to some vendors, it's not always clear, right? But the amount of mental, emotional, and physical trauma that our folks are experiencing as a matter of as a result of what all that's going on is incredible, right? And I think we've been really trying to figure out how do we prioritize holistically the well-being of our folks. So I think that's something that I always want to make sure people leave with at the end of any conversation that's happening for our community, and just really being able to trust, right, the leadership of those directly impacted. I can't say that enough. There's not enough to be able to emphasize about why people who are experiencing this day in, day out have the solutions, and their leaderships need to be developed, that they need to be supported, and figure out whatever solutions need to be created, how to figure out how to be better allies and supporters to those people, right? So I really think that as we're moving forward in this time, and hasn't even been a year of this mess yet, but I think really need to be able to prioritize and center Black undocumented folks, queer and trans folks, and all the other folks that you mentioned that really need to be able to be additionally supported, right? And just know that at the end of the day, there is so much power and beauty and resiliency in our people, right? So we're not helpless, right? But we do need support. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jonathan, for that powerful message around resilience, strength, well-being, trauma-informed, and really remembering that and the strengths of community. So thank you for raising that. And I know we're right about at time, but we have a great question from Edward Jones to our funders, which I'd like to take a few minutes to ask, which is, are there long-term commitments for federal policy, the work that's going towards that, and rapid response support on immigration issues? How is that balanced? And how about the sanctuary city engagement work, if any of you all do that work? And so any of our funders, Marco, Ali, or Julia?
This is Ali. I'll take this just quickly. So I think it's a great question. We at Solidarity Minnesota are really trying to leverage the expertise of our grantees to kind of lead us and guide us in that work. And so in the grant application, it was broad enough to encompass all of those aspects of grant making, so long-term, short-term, sanctuary city, know your rights, everything. And so we're leaving it to them to guide us in the response, and then using our community review team to help shift resources in the right direction. We do have to be somewhat careful in the federal policy space because as a coalition of funders, we have to be mindful of what our different board tolerances are for policy engagement. Mostly we're okay as long as we're funding somebody else to do the work and not taking a direct statement ourselves, but I will say that that is a nuance that any funder coalition probably has to pay attention to. And I will say in the applications that are at least moving to the next round for our larger investments, there were several sanctuary city political engagement activities that were brought up.
This is Marco. Just responding to the long-term commitment, one of the things that I think is really important in the way that we are structured is the fact that we're driven by individuals who are directly impacted, which is inclusive of individuals from the trans, women of color community, the LGBTQ Black community, the LGBTQ Muslim community, LGBTQ undocumented community, the rural farmer community, and for us, the donor special interest doesn't. We align ourselves with individuals who are resourcing our work, who have a close alignment to our values. And understanding that the grant making and decision making power is in the hands of these individuals who are closest both to the challenges that they're facing in their own communities and then in their own lives, but that they truly believe that they're also closest to the solutions that those communities need. And so our long-term commitment will always be there because we will always have individuals who are guiding the decision making of our organization who are directly closely aligned with the issues that as they develop and as they transform, that they're going to be responsive to it.
Great. Thank you so much, Marco and Ali. Before I hand this off, I know that there are just some more questions out there, but if we could take a moment to rate our program, with 5 being the highest rating, we ask you to please submit your response, and you'll also have an opportunity at the end to offer any other suggestions. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to Huang and Camelia to close us today, and we will follow up with those outstanding questions. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. This is Hung Nguyen Yap from AAPI. I'd first like to thank our speakers for taking time to provide updates and strategies on supporting the DACA communities, specifically those that are often underrepresented in the national conversation. We also like to thank our partners again for their commitment to this work and ensuring that conversations like today are happening. Philanthropy has an important role in supporting the work and the efforts of all documented individuals and their families. At AAPI, we look forward to continuing to support the work of all Dreamers as they pursue their goals and to having more philanthropic and community partners join us in that commitment. We invite everyone to continue this conversation through our 10 regional chapters across the country and the National Giving Circle Network. Please also save the date for our national network convening in San Francisco on April 27th and 28th as we take a deeper dive into innovative funding partnerships between API communities and funders in the Bay Area. I also like to thank GSIRF for their leadership in this work and would like to pass it on to Camelia.
Thanks so much, Hung. And we wanted to share that we will be sending today's slides with everybody who participated in today's webinar. And we invite all of you to also attend GSIR's National Convening, which will be happening February 28th to March 1st in Los Angeles, California. So see our website for more details. You can register now. And please also feel free to go to GSIR's website for upcoming programs and resources on DACA, TBS, and other key areas of work. Thank you again for joining us today, and please feel free to reach out to GSIR, to APIP, or to any of our other co-sponsor partners from this webinar. Thank you, everybody, and thank you again to our speakers. Have a great day.